In the spring of 1846, two armies stood poised on opposite sides of the Rio Grande, ready to plunge North America into a conflict that would reshape the entire continent. On one side, the Mexican army, a force of approximately 30,000 soldiers defending their homeland against what they perceived as naked aggression. On the other, the United States military, smaller in initial numbers but backed by a growing industrial economy and an ideology that many Americans believed gave them a divine right to expand across the continent. What followed over the next 2 years would result in one of the most dramatic territorial acquisitions in world history, as the United States would seize nearly half of Mexico's territory, an area of over 500,000 square miles, that would eventually become California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and parts of Colorado, Wyoming, Kansas, and Oklahoma. The speed and completeness of this conquest raises profound questions about military effectiveness, political will, economic resources, and the nature of 19th century warfare. How could Mexico, with its substantial military force and the defensive advantage of fighting on home soil, lose so catastrophically in such a short period? The answer lies in a complex web of political instability, economic disparity, technological advantages, strategic brilliance, logistical superiority, and fundamental differences in national cohesion that made this conflict far more uneven than raw troop numbers would suggest. The roots of this war stretched back decades, intertwining with the very fabric of American expansionist ideology and Mexican national insecurity. The United States in the 1840s was gripped by a fervent belief in manifest destiny, the conviction that Anglo-Saxon Americans were destined, even obligated by divine providence, to spread their democratic institutions and Protestant culture across the North American continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. This ideology was not merely abstract philosophy, but a driving political force that influenced elections, shaped foreign policy, and motivated thousands of American settlers to push westward into territories that Mexico considered its own. The Texas Revolution of 1836 had already severed one of Mexico's northern provinces, and although Mexico never officially recognized Texas independence, the reality was that Texas had been functioning as an independent republic for nearly a decade by the time it was annexed by the United States in 1845. This annexation was the immediate trigger for war, as Mexico viewed it as an act of theft and aggression, while American expansionists saw it as the natural fulfillment of both the wishes of Texan settlers and the broader mission of continental dominance. President James K. 1880-17. Crisis. Polk, who took office in March 1845, was an ardent expansionist who had campaigned on promises of territorial acquisition. Polk wanted not just Texas, but also the vast territories of California and New Mexico, regions that were sparsely populated by Mexican citizens, but increasingly attractive to American settlers and merchants who saw enormous economic potential in Pacific ports and fertile lands. The dispute over the Texas border provided Polk with the justification he sought for military action. Texas and the United States claimed that the border lay at the Rio Grande, while Mexico insisted it remained at the Nueces River, roughly 150 miles to the north. This disputed territory, though largely empty scrubland, became the flashpoint for war. In January 1846, Polk ordered General Zachary Taylor to advance with his army into the disputed zone, positioning troops directly on the Rio Grande, opposite the Mexican city of Matamoros. This was a provocative move designed to either intimidate Mexico into selling California and New Mexico, or to provoke a military response that would give Polk his justification for war. The Mexican government, led by President Mariano Paredes, faced an impossible situation. To back down would invite political catastrophe, as Mexican public opinion was already inflamed by the loss of Texas, and any further concessions would likely trigger revolution. To fight meant confronting a technologically superior opponent with an economy many times larger than Mexico's, yet national honor demanded resistance, and Mexican military leaders, confident in their numerical advantage and fighting spirit, believed they could defeat the Americans in battle. The first shots came on April 25, 1846, when Mexican cavalry crossed the Rio Grande and ambushed an American patrol, killing 11 soldiers. When news reached Washington in early May, Polk seized the moment, declaring to Congress that Mexico had invaded American territory and shed American blood on American soil. Congress responded with a declaration of war, though not without significant opposition from Whig politicians and anti-slavery advocates who saw the war as a transparent attempt to acquire new territory for the expansion of slavery. Nevertheless, the die was cast, and America mobilized for war with an enthusiasm that surprised even expansionist leaders. Volunteer regiments formed across the country, with young men eager for glory and adventure. The regular army, which numbered only about 7,500 men before the war, would eventually swell to over 100,000 when volunteers and new recruits were included, though never did the entire force serve simultaneously due to the nature of enlistments and deployments. Mexico's military situation was far more complicated than simple troop counts suggested. While Mexico could indeed field 30,000 soldiers, a number that would grow during the war, these forces suffered from systemic problems that would prove devastating in combat. The Mexican army was largely composed of poorly trained conscripts, often indigenous peasants pressed into service against their will, with little loyalty to the central government and minimal military training. The officer corps was politicized, with appointments based more on political connections than military competence, and generals frequently plotted against each other and the civilian government. Mexico had experienced decades of political instability since gaining independence from Spain in 1821, with the presidency changing hands numerous times through coups and revolutions. This instability meant that no consistent military doctrine had been developed, no systematic training program implemented, and no reliable supply system established. Soldiers often went unpaid for months, equipment was outdated or in disrepair, and artillery pieces were frequently obsolete designs from the Napoleonic era. The economy of Mexico, devastated by years of civil conflict and lacking the industrial base of the United States, could not produce modern weapons or maintain existing ones. While Mexican soldiers often fought with tremendous courage and determination, bravery alone could not overcome these structural disadvantages. In contrast, the United States military, though small in peacetime, was a professional force with a highly educated officer corps trained at West Point Military Academy, where they studied the latest European military theories and tactics. American artillery was superior in both quality and quantity, with lighter, more mobile cannon that could be moved quickly across the battlefield and concentrated where needed. American soldiers, whether regulars or volunteers, generally had better access to firearms through civilian life, as gun ownership was common in American society, meaning that even volunteer units had soldiers with basic familiarity with weapons. The United States had a growing industrial economy capable of producing vast quantities of supplies, weapons, and ammunition, and the country's system of roads, canals, and increasingly railroads allowed for more efficient movement of troops and material, at least within American territory. American naval power was vastly superior to Mexico's almost non-existent navy, giving the United States the ability to blockade Mexican ports, cutting off customs revenues that Mexico desperately needed, and to launch amphibious operations along the Mexican coast. General Zachary Taylor, commanding American forces along the Rio Grande, found himself facing a Mexican army determined to drive him back. In early May 1846, Mexican General Mariano Arista crossed the Rio Grande with approximately 6,000 troops, intent on destroying Taylor's force before reinforcements could arrive. The two armies met at Palo Alto on May 8, 1846, in the first major engagement of the war. The battle showcased the decisive advantage of American artillery. Mexican forces advanced in traditional Napoleonic columns, brave soldiers marching into withering fire from American cannon. The American artillery, using mobile horse-drawn guns, could quickly reposition and concentrate fire, while Mexican artillery, heavier and less mobile, struggled to respond effectively. American gunners used explosive shells rather than solid shot, and these shells, detonating above and among Mexican formations, caused horrific casualties. The dry grass of the battlefield caught fire from the artillery, creating confusion and terror among Mexican ranks. Despite repeated cavalry charges and infantry assaults that demonstrated Mexican courage, Arista's forces could not close with the Americans effectively, and eventually withdrew after suffering heavy casualties. American losses were minimal, fewer than 50 casualties compared to Mexican losses estimated at several hundred. The following day, May 9th, the armies clashed again at Resaca de la Palma, where terrain forced closer combat. American infantry, armed with more reliable muskets and rifles, engaged Mexican troops in thick chaparral. Again, American artillery played a crucial role, and a dramatic charge by American dragoons captured several Mexican artillery pieces and threw Mexican forces into disorder. Arista's army retreated in confusion across the Rio Grande, abandoning equipment and supplies. These early victories electrified American public opinion and demoralized Mexican forces. Taylor became an instant hero, his calm demeanor under fire earning him the nickname Old Rough and Ready, and he would eventually parlay his military fame into the presidency. For Mexico, these defeats revealed the harsh reality of the military imbalance they faced, but political leaders in Mexico City refused to accept this reality, instead blaming individual commanders and demanding continued resistance. Taylor's army crossed the Rio Grande and occupied Matamoros, then pushed deeper into northern Mexico. His advance was methodical and deliberate, reflecting his cautious nature and the logistical challenges of operating in hostile territory. Supply lines stretched hundreds of miles through difficult terrain, and Taylor's army relied on wagon trains that were vulnerable to attack and slow to move. Nevertheless, by September 1846, Taylor had captured the fortified city of Monterrey after a fierce three-day battle that saw house-to-house fighting and significant casualties on both sides. The Battle of Monterrey demonstrated that Mexican soldiers, when fighting from prepared defensive positions, could inflict serious losses on attacking Americans. The city's stone buildings and narrow streets negated much of the American artillery advantage, and Mexican defenders fought tenaciously. American forces had to storm fortified positions in costly frontal assaults, and Taylor's decision to grant generous surrender terms to the Mexican garrison, allowing them to withdraw with their weapons, provoked controversy in Washington. President Polk, frustrated with Taylor's caution and increasingly concerned that the general's growing popularity might make him a political rival, began to seek alternative strategies and commanders. While Taylor campaigned in northern Mexico, American forces opened other fronts that revealed the global scope of American strategic thinking. In California, American settlers and military forces under Captain John C. Fremont and Commodore Robert Stockton moved to seize control of the sparsely populated Mexican province. California's Mexican government was weak, with perhaps only a few hundred soldiers to defend the entire territory, and the local population was divided between Californians of Spanish and Mexican descent and the growing number of American settlers. The Bear Flag Revolt in June 1846 saw American settlers declare California's independence from Mexico, and American naval and military forces quickly took control of key ports including Monterrey and San Francisco. Resistance was initially minimal, but in Southern California, Mexican forces under José María Flores staged a comeback, recapturing Los Angeles and other towns. American forces under General Stephen Kearny marched overland from New Mexico, and, after a difficult battle at San Pascual, where Mexican lancers inflicted significant casualties, joined with Stockton sailors and Marines to retake Southern California. By January 1847, California was firmly in American hands. a conquest accomplished with relatively few troops, but decisive in achieving one of Polk's primary war aims, securing the Pacific ports that would transform American trade and naval power. New Mexico fell even more easily to American arms. General Kearny led an expedition from Kansas to Santa Fe, the capital of New Mexico, and arrived in August 1846 to find that Mexican Governor Manuel Armijo had fled without fighting. The Mexican government had failed to reinforce New Mexico, and many locals, including the Hispanic population, who had endured years of neglect from Mexico City, saw little reason to resist. Kearny proclaimed American sovereignty and established a temporary government before continuing westward to California. A brief rebellion in Taos in January 1847, led by Mexicans and Pueblo Indians opposed to American rule, was crushed quickly, and New Mexico remained under American control for the rest of the war. The ease of these conquests reflected the fundamental weakness of Mexican control over its northern territories, regions that were thousands of miles from the center of Mexican power and connected by poor roads through difficult terrain. Mexico City's inability to defend or effectively govern these distant provinces made them vulnerable to American aggression. By late 1846, despite American successes on multiple fronts, the war was not over. Mexico refused to negotiate, and no Mexican government could survive if it agreed to cede the territories Polk demanded. Mexican politics remained chaotic, with military leaders and politicians jockeying for power, and the prospect of military defeat actually strengthened hardline factions who argued for continued resistance. President Polk and his military planners concluded that only a direct attack on Mexico City itself would force Mexico to accept peace on American terms. This decision led to one of the most remarkable military campaigns in American history, an amphibious invasion at Veracruz followed by an overland march of 200 miles to the Mexican capital, echoing Hernán Cortés's conquest of the Aztec Empire 3 centuries earlier. Polk selected General Winfield Scott to command this operation, despite personal animosity between the two men. Scott, known as Old Fuss and Feathers for his attention to military protocol and appearance, was the Army's senior general and, unlike Taylor, a trained military strategist with a sophisticated understanding of combined operations. Scott's Veracruz campaign began in March 1847 with the largest amphibious operation in American military history to that date, landing approximately 12,000 troops near Veracruz, using specially designed surf boats. The landing, conducted under the protection of naval guns, was executed almost flawlessly, with minimal casualties, despite initial fears of strong resistance. Veracruz itself was Mexico's most important port, and was heavily fortified with substantial stone walls and numerous artillery pieces. Scott, aware that a direct assault would be costly, laid siege to the city, positioning artillery and naval guns to bombard the fortifications while cutting off supply and escape routes. The bombardment lasted for days, with American shells falling into the city and causing civilian casualties that provoked international criticism. The Mexican garrison under General Juan Morales fought stubbornly, but faced hopeless odds, and after negotiations, the city surrendered on March 29, 1847. The capture of Veracruz gave Scott a secure base of operations and access to the National Road, the main route from Veracruz to Mexico City. Scott's advance inland required moving an army through mountainous terrain, while maintaining a vulnerable supply line stretching back to Veracruz. The Mexican government, now led by Antonio López de Santa Anna, who had returned from exile and seized power by promising to save Mexico from the American invasion, assembled a new army to block Scott's advance. Santa Anna, a veteran of numerous Mexican political and military conflicts, including the Texas Revolution, where his victory at the Alamo had been overshadowed by his defeat and capture at San Jacinto, was a controversial figure, brilliant in some respects but erratic and unreliable. He had spent months fighting Taylor in northern Mexico, including a bloody battle at Buena Vista, In February 1847, where Mexican forces nearly defeated Taylor's outnumbered army, but ultimately withdrew, and now he repositioned his forces to confront Scott. The first major engagement came at Cerro Gordo in April 1847, where Santa Anna positioned his army in a seemingly impregnable position in the mountains, blocking the Cole National Road. Mexican forces held the high ground with artillery commanding the narrow pass, and Santa Anna was confident that Scott would have to attack uphill into prepared defenses. However, Scott's engineers, including a young officer named Robert E. Lee, who would later achieve fame as a Confederate general, discovered a flanking route through difficult terrain that Mexican commanders had dismissed as impassable. American forces, hauling artillery up steep slopes through dense vegetation, managed to position themselves on the Mexican flank and rear. When the attack came, Mexican forces found themselves assaulted from unexpected directions, their defensive positions compromised, and their escape routes threatened. Despite fierce fighting in some sectors, the Mexican army broke and fled, suffering thousands of casualties and losing large quantities of equipment. Santa Anna barely escaped capture, and his army dissolved into scattered fragments. The victory at Cerro Gordo opened the road to Mexico's interior and demonstrated Scott's tactical brilliance and the competence of his staff officers. Scott's army pushed forward, occupying the city of Puebla, Mexico's second-largest city, in May 1847 without a fight, as the municipal authorities preferred to negotiate rather than see their city destroyed. Scott established Puebla as his forward base and waited for reinforcements and supplies. This pause allowed Santa Anna time to reorganize Mexican forces and prepare defenses around Mexico City. The Mexican capital was a city of over 200,000 people, the political, economic, and cultural heart of the nation, surrounded by mountains and approached by causeways across marshy ground, natural defenses that had protected the Aztec capital centuries before. Santa Anna fortified key positions, including the hilltop castle of Chapultepec and the fortified convents at Churubusco, and assembled approximately 25,000 troops for the defense of the capital. Mexican morale remained high in some units, particularly among troops defending their capital, and there was hope that the American army, now operating hundreds of miles from its supply base, might be vulnerable. Scott's final approach to Mexico City in August 1847 involved a series of battles that tested both armies to their limits. At Contreras and Churubusco, on August 19 and 20, American forces attacked strongly held Mexican positions in fierce fighting that produced heavy casualties. At Churubusco, Mexican defenders, including a battalion of Irish immigrants, who had deserted from the American army and formed the San Patricio Battalion, fought desperately behind the thick walls of the convent. The battle raged for hours, with Mexican artillery firing at point-blank range and American infantry launching repeated assaults. Eventually, superior American firepower and tactical coordination broke Mexican resistance, and the defenders were overwhelmed. The captured members of the San Patricio Battalion faced court-martial for desertion, and many were hanged in one of the war's most controversial episodes. The battles of Contreras and Churubusco cost Mexico thousands of casualties and pushed American forces to the gates of Mexico City, but Santa Anna's army, though battered, had not been destroyed. A temporary armistice followed as American and Mexican negotiators attempted to reach a peace settlement, but talks collapsed when it became clear that Mexico would not agree to the territorial cessions that Polk demanded. Fighting resumed in September, with American forces attacking Molino del Rey on September 8, a complex of stone buildings that Americans incorrectly believed housed a cannon foundry. The battle was brutal and costly, with American forces suffering over 700 casualties in taking the position, one of the highest casualty rates of the war relative to forces engaged. Mexican defenders fought with determination, and the battle demonstrated that Mexican soldiers remained capable of inflicting significant losses on American forces even in defeat. The final major battle came at Chapultepec on September 13, 1847, the climax of the Mexico City campaign. Chapultepec Castle, sitting atop a 200-foot-high hill, was a formidable fortress, defended by Mexican regulars and cadets from the military academy housed in the castle. Scott ordered a massive artillery bombardment, followed by infantry assault up the steep slopes. American troops attacked in multiple columns, using scaling ladders to climb the walls under heavy fire. Mexican defenders fought desperately, and the battle became a close-quarters melee inside the fortress. Among the defenders were teenage military cadets, some as young as 13, who refused to surrender and fought to the death. These Niños heroes, or boy heroes, became martyrs in Mexican national memory, symbols of courage and sacrifice in a lost cause. American forces eventually overwhelmed the defenders and captured the castle, opening the way into Mexico City itself. American troops pushed along the causeways toward the city center, fighting street battles against remaining Mexican defenders and civilian resistors. By the evening of September 14th, American forces occupied the Central Plaza, and the American flag flew over the National Palace. Santa Anna withdrew what remained of his army, and eventually resigned his command. The capital of Mexico was in American hands. The occupation of Mexico City did not immediately end the war, as guerrilla resistance continued in many areas, and the Mexican government, now relocated to Querétaro, initially refused to negotiate. However, the reality was inescapable. Mexico's armies had been defeated in every major engagement, the capital was occupied, the treasury was empty, and the country was exhausted. Mexican moderates, led by politicians who recognized that continued resistance would only bring further destruction, gained ascendancy, and began serious negotiations with American envoy Nicholas Trist. Trist had been sent by Polk to negotiate peace, and though Polk had actually recalled him by this point, frustrated with his perceived lack of progress, Trist ignored the recall and continued negotiations, believing he had a chance to achieve a settlement. The resulting Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed in February 1848, ended the war on terms that realized all of Polk's territorial objectives. Mexico ceded California, New Mexico, and the disputed Texas Territory, approximately half of Mexico's national territory, in exchange for $15 million, and the assumption of American citizens' claims against Mexico totaling another $3.25 million. Mexican citizens living in the ceded territories were promised American citizenship and property rights, though these promises would often be violated in practice. The Rio Grande was established as the Texas border. The Mexican Congress, faced with the choice between accepting these terms or continuing a hopeless war, ratified the treaty in May 1848, and the American Senate followed. The war was officially over. The conquest of half of Mexico in only 2 years was the result of multiple factors working in concert. American military superiority in artillery, logistics, and professional leadership proved decisive in every major engagement. The United States Navy's control of the seas allowed for amphibious operations and blockades that Mexico could not counter. American industrial capacity enabled the production and distribution of weapons, ammunition, and supplies on a scale Mexico could not match. The United States political system, despite opposition from some quarters, maintained enough consensus to prosecute the war effectively, while Mexico's chronic political instability meant that military commanders fought each other as much as the Americans, and civilian governments rose and fell with bewildering rapidity. The geography of Mexico, with its long distances, poor infrastructure, and difficult terrain, made it nearly impossible for Mexican forces to concentrate effectively or to defend the sparsely populated northern territories that were America's primary objectives. Mexican soldiers often fought bravely, and Mexican casualties, estimated at around 25,000 military deaths compared to American losses of about 13,000, demonstrate the willingness of Mexican forces to engage in battle. But courage alone could not overcome the systemic disadvantages they faced. The war transformed the United States into a continental power stretching from ocean to ocean, fulfilling the vision of manifest destiny. that had motivated the conflict. The acquired territories would prove immensely valuable, particularly California, where the discovery of gold in 1848, just days before the treaty was signed, would trigger the largest gold rush in American history and transform California into an economic powerhouse. The ports of San Diego, Los Angeles, and San Francisco became crucial to American Pacific trade and naval power. However, the acquisition of so much new territory reopened and intensified the political conflict over slavery that had been temporarily quieted by the Missouri Compromise. The question of whether slavery would be allowed in the new territories dominated American politics for the next decade and contributed directly to the outbreak of the American Civil War in 1861. Many of the young officers who gained experience and distinction in the Mexican War, including Ulysses S. Grant, Robert E. Lee, Thomas Jackson, George McClellan, and many others, would face each other as commanders in that far more terrible conflict. For Mexico, the war was a national catastrophe, a humiliation that scarred Mexican national consciousness and contributed to decades of political instability. The loss of half the national territory, including some of the most economically promising regions, was a blow from which Mexico struggled to recover. The war exposed the weakness of Mexican institutions and the inability of Mexican elites to forge national unity or to modernize the country's military and economy. Mexican memory of the war, particularly the martyrdom of the Niños heroes at Chapultepec, became central to Mexican nationalism, a story of resistance against overwhelming odds and foreign aggression. The payment of $15 million, while substantial by the standards of the time, seemed a paltry sum for so vast a territory, and many Mexicans viewed the war as naked theft disguised by a fig leaf of legal purchase. The Mexican-American War stands as one of the clearest examples of how apparent military parity, as suggested by troop numbers, can mask profound imbalances in military effectiveness. Mexico's 30,000 soldiers, on paper a formidable force, proved unable to defend the nation against an American military machine that was better equipped, better led, better supplied, and backed by a far stronger economy and more stable political system. The war demonstrated the importance of logistics, artillery, professional military education, and national cohesion in determining military outcomes. It showed how technological and organizational advantages could allow a smaller force to defeat a larger one repeatedly. The speed of American conquest, occupying half a country in 2 years including a march from the coast to an inland capital, was remarkable by the standards of 19th century warfare and reflected both American strengths and Mexican weaknesses. The war reshaped North America permanently, creating the territorial basis for the modern United States and leaving Mexico diminished and bitter. It remains one of the most consequential conflicts in American history, achieving enormous territorial gains at relatively low cost in American lives and treasure, but also sowing seeds of future conflict both internationally and domestically. Understanding how and why the United States was able to conquer half of Mexico so quickly requires examining not just the battles themselves, but the underlying economic, political, technological, and social factors that determined which nation was capable of projecting military power effectively, and which, despite its soldiers' bravery and its defensive advantages, simply lacked the institutional capacity to resist successfully.